Hello, my name is Ara Keshishian, and I'd like to talk about a number of metabolic pathways. Specifically, we'll discuss about the implication of weight loss surgery and the duodenal switch operation on fat, protein, and carbohydrate absorption and metabolism. So, this very detailed and almost impossible to read slide is sort of a summary of the entire metabolic pathways in one form or another that take place in our body. Um, the Krebs cycle, which is sort of the um, pathway by which our body processes most of the energy sources, is on this slide. Talking about Krebs cycles specifically, it's sort of towards the middle of the slide, and if we start from the left and top side, we can appreciate that proteins, carbohydrate, and lipids, such as fats, are taken in. In the case of the proteins, they're converted, broken down to amino acids. Carbohydrates are all broken down into sugars, and the lipids are broken down and divided into glycerol and the fatty acids. Um, Through a number of different mechanisms and different pathways, they all, in one form or another, end up at the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is the chain of chemical reactions through which a common substrate, the acetyl CoA, is taken in, and as the acetyl CoA being the substrate of the Krebs cycle, the end result is production of the carbon dioxide, the CO2, water, and energy that's used in our entire body. Let's specifically talk about some of these reactions. The food is converted into energy by a set of oxidative stages, and the end result, as we talked about in the last stage, the 1, 2, 3, 4 on the left that sort of outlines on the slide, is the production of the carbon dioxide and water. The first stage is breakdown of the food that we've taken in the form of carbohydrate, fat, and protein into building block molecules that can be absorbed. There are a number of chemical pathways and reactions that take place. And as I discussed on the previous slide briefly, the end result of all of these pathways is to convert everything and anything that we've taken in by mouth, whether it's carbohydrate, fat, or protein, into acetyl CoA. And the acetyl CoA then feeds into this energy producing cycle, if you would, the so-called the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle oxidizes the acetyl CoA to carbon dioxide, and this releases the energy that's used in the body through a number of other reactions. The end result of it is, again, we take in the carbohydrate, protein, and the fat, and the end result is through a common denominator molecule, which is acetyl CoA, in a common set of chemical reactions, the Krebs cycle, and the end result is production of the carbon dioxide, water, and the source of the energy that our body uses. Um, a few sort of other things to appreciate is, in summary, there's a common currency with all of those metabolic pathways. And I know I'm repeating myself again and again, but this will become a significant point to remember in down a few slides here, that the common currency in our body is the acetyl CoA in one form or another. The common end result is the TCA cycle, the Krebs cycle. So if I was to take an excessive amount of fat, protein, or carbohydrate, independent of which one I'm taking, for the most part, from an energy perspective, if it's not utilized, it will end up being a source of energy to the Krebs cycle, the acetyl CoA. There are different pathways that are taken, and this means that there are different regulatory mechanisms that are in place. And the production of the ATP, water, and the CO2, the ATP is the currency, the fuel, if you would, of the cellular level, and the CO2 and the water are the end results. As you can see on the sort of slide on the left hand, so the picture on the left side of the slide, there are a number of negative feedback loop mechanisms that feed back into the origin. So there's some lighter purple arrows that point from the right lower quadrant, the NAD plus, that point up towards the glycolysis and other pathways by which a negative feedback mechanism in place. So if there is a surplus of a certain end product at the output end of the Krebs cycle, those by themselves will initiate a blocking step so that things don't overgenerate on the result end of this. And this also has consequences that it will essentially prevent from the body producing, for example, acetyl-CoA, and form the production of the fat if there's excess amount of a certain substrate in place. So what happens when we eat briefly? After a well-fed state, immediately the blood sugar rises, and this increases the release of the insulin from the pancreas. The three major end organs are the liver cells, muscle cells, and the adipose and the fat cells. Insulin promote glycogen synthesis in the liver and the muscle. And we can think about the glycogen as the storage of the sugar molecules, if you would, sort of a relatively and readily available source of sugar in our body. After glycogen stores are filled, liver converts extra glucose to fatty acid and triglycerides. So let's read that again one more time. As the glucose that we've taken in is converted into glycogen, which is sort of the storage molecules for the sugar, once all of those stores have been replenished, any extra glycogen, any extra glucose that's left over will be converted through a set of pathways into fatty acid and triglycerides. Insulin promotes triglyceride synthesis in the adipose tissue. So acetyl-CoA that is not utilized also in the Krebs cycle will be stored as a fatty acid. So this is an example of when in a well-fed state, when we are consuming glucose more than our body needs, then any extra amount of it by two different mechanisms based on the effect of insulin on fatty cell as well as the acetyl-CoA of the Krebs cycle, any extra glucose will be converted into fatty acids and triglycerides. Continuing with the carbohydrate metabolisms, they're broken down into the simplest form in the form of a glucose. They undergo glycolysis pathway, which converts the glucose to pyruvate, and that's necessary for the acetyl-CoA and ATP production. So this slide essentially outlines the specific steps between the generation of the glucose to acetyl-CoA, which feeds into the Krebs cycle. Please note that if the excess amount of acetyl-CoA has a negative feedback, and that will cause conversion into fatty acids with the excessive amount of carbohydrate intake. Moving on into the protein metabolism, protein from dietary intake is digested and broken down into amino acids. Those are sort of the building blocks of the protein. Think of a big Lego set that now it's been broken down into individual Lego pieces. Excess amino acids are mobilized and their carbon skeletons are used to form glucose. So excessive amount of protein is broken down to individual amino acids, and in excessive form, individual amino acids are broken down even further to become glucose. And if we have an excess amount of glucose, either directly because of glucose intake or because of excessive amount of protein that we've taken in that's not being utilized and converted to glucose, as we talked during the previous slides, this will result in production of the free fatty acid and the adipose storage. Having excess amount of protein, if not being utilized, will slow or even in some cases stop the weight loss. Protein is needed to maintain and prevent loss it is important to appreciate that excessive amount of proteins needs to be only taken in when there is a matching amount and requirement for the protein that's taken in. So a bodybuilder who's exercising with a significant amount of strenuous activity to build muscle mass may require significant amount of protein to maintain the muscle mass, whereas just from a sake of numbers point of view, an individual that does not have the muscle building requirements for that amount of protein will result in taking some of the protein in and more of it will be converted into glucose and eventually into fatty acid and storage of adipose tissue. When we talk about fat metabolism itself goes through a series of reaction where high fat meals contain large amount of triglycerides and smaller amounts of cholesterols and cholesterol esters, which is sort of the salt material. All of these things are broken into by the biliary and pancreatic secretions, and they are then reprocessed and repacked in a soluble format, which are chylomicrons. These are, if you would be a soap material that covers the fatty cells that makes it soluble to be able to be absorbed through the water-soluble mucous membranes. Excessive amount of fat consumption leads to increased deposition in the adipose tissue and formation of the new fat cells. And it is also important to remember that not all of the fats need this breakdown and reconfiguration using a chylomicron for it to get absorbed. An example of this is the coconut oil with medium chain fatty acids that will get absorbed without relying on the biliary secretion through enterohepatic circulation, and these excess amount of medium chain fatty acids will be converted into excess energy. So this seems to be the latest fad that's going on right now, where a lot of coconut oil is being recommended to be a health remedy for a number of things. And a word of caution that an excessive amount of it will get absorbed independent of the patients having had duodenal switch operation, how much of a short common channel they've had. Let's go back as an overview again. And so what we're talking about is the absorption of the carbohydrate, fat, and protein that's taken in, and they're all converted into their base molecules or building blocks, the sugar, the fatty acids, and glycerol, and the amino acids, which through different metabolic processes all are converted to acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA feeds as a single initiation point to the Krebs cycle, generating the carbon dioxide, water, and the common currency that all of the body's cells use as a form of energy. So as we've talked about it on the beginning of this lecture, the starting point of being carbohydrate, fat, and protein is almost independent of where they all end up as form of energy is concerned, that they all end up in a form of acetyl-CoA and the Krebs cycle. I would like to one more time review the Krebs cycle before we wrap into the last two slides. The Krebs cycle is on the left-hand side, sort of a repeat of one of the slides that we had before. That protein, carbohydrate, and the fat is taken in, converts into acetyl-CoA, and the Krebs cycle takes the acetyl-CoA as a substrate and converts it into CO2, ATP, which is the energy source, and water. If you really would love to spend some time understanding the biochemistry of this, the image on the right shows the organic chemistry of the reactions that take place, where the acetyl-CoA enters this Krebs cycle at 12 o'clock, and through a number of different reactions, the electrons are exchanged, and we end up starting where we started from, into the circle. And as the molecules are converted from one form or another, or an isomer from one form or another throughout the cycle, from going on from 1 o'clock to 11 o'clock. And when the acetyl-CoA causes the reaction of the Krebs cycle to initiate, is that the electrons are exchanged and ATP is generated. So this is sort of the summary of the Krebs cycle. Now I would like to talk about the Krebs cycle, which we are frequently hearing about in a case of the duodenal switch patients. Excessive fat in our diet can cause loose bowel movements. Loose bowel movements causes saponification of the calcium and or the vitamin D, because loose bowel movement will increase the transit time, will shorten the transit time, increase the speed of the bowel movements. This may actually cause not only dehydration but also low calcium and vitamin D. Then the patient has to take more calcium and vitamin D, and the excessive amount of calcium will cause constipation. And the constipation is supposed to be remedied through anecdotal information by having increased fat in the diet, when this vicious cycle continues. So when we compare the Krebs cycle, which is essentially the energy production by acetyl-CoA being the triggering mechanism for the Krebs cycle to continue through its cycle, what happens with the duodenal switch patients is that when we have excess amount of fat in our diet, that will speed up. Think of it as the conveyor belt that pushes the food down our GI tract, and it allows a certain amount of time for the absorption to take place. The more fat in our diet, the faster the speed of the conveyor belt, the less time to absorption takes place. And that drives the calcium down, and drives the vitamin D down, and drives down the time for us to be able to absorb the water. That will result in patients becoming dehydrated with low calcium, and we overtreat this by significantly increasing our calcium, and dehydration can cause constipation itself, which in turn we turn back and treat it with more fat intake, which only complicates this matter. This is in addition to what we talked about earlier, that any excess amount of fat, specifically in terms of coconut oil, etc., that have medium chain fatty acids, excessive calorie can be absorbed. In addition to any amount of protein that we take that's not processed for structural form, all will be converted into a form of an extra energy that will cause weight gain, if not inadequate weight loss. So in summary, I think we should aim for the Krebs cycle, not the Krebs cycle. Weight loss surgery, duodenal switch operation can be undone by poor dietary choices, by extreme dietary modification, by things that are not scientifically proven, such as excessive consumption of fat, excessive, and in almost some cases, any consumption of coconut oil, excessive amount of protein that's not justifiable by forms of muscle building exercises, all of which physiologically result in undoing the effect of the weight loss surgery. Let's think about the fact that by the structure of the duodenal switch operation, we are trying to reduce our body's ability to absorb the fat, carbohydrate, and by choice or not, some protein. And yet what we're doing with some of these dietary recommendations that are made, we're only undoing the anatomical benefits of the duodenal switch. Do not do excessive fat. Let's distinguish between what we call low fat and what some may recommend as extremely high fat. A normal fat diet does not include large volumes, or in fact any significant volumes of heavy whipping cream, blocks of butter, etc. Excessive protein that's not being utilized will be converted and stored as calories, as the slide showed previously. A common healthy diet is what I recommend, and it's outlined on our website. And just briefly to remind everyone, it's water, protein, everything else, no carbonated drink, no artificial sweeteners, stay close to the dirt, and the Elmo diet, eat less more often. You cannot help absorption of anything by having excessive amount of fat in your diet. This is in response to some concerns that has been brought up to my attention, where patients are told, well, if your vitamin D is low and vitamin D is fat soluble, then having excessive amount of fat in your diet will help the vitamin D that's not being absorbed to get absorbed. And in fact, that's factually and anatomically completely opposite of what will happen, because as we talked about on the Krebs cycle, excess amount of fat will cause loose bowel movement, which will cause increasing the speed of the conveyor belt, the diarrhea, and reduction in the fat and fat soluble vitamin absorption. Thank you. Have a good day.